The man on the left is laughing. It is not a polite chuckle or a smirk. It is a full-throated, unrestrained explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. His head is thrown back, his mouth wide open, his eyes crinkled into slits of sheer delight. In front of him sits a hamburger on a plate and a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. The man in the middle is crying. He holds a white napkin to his face, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped. He is overcome, but with what? Is it joy? Is it grief? Is it shame? The man on the right eats with a quiet, solemn intensity. He takes a bite of his own hamburger, his gaze fixed on the meal as if it holds the answer to some profound, unanswerable question. All three men are young, their heads shaved. They wear simple, drab uniforms, stenciled with the letters POW, prisoners of war. These are soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, captured in the brutal fighting of the Pacific War, now seated at a table somewhere in the heart of America, and they are breaking down. This single photograph, taken in a U.S. prisoner of war camp in 1943, captures one of the most bizarre and powerful psychological weapons of the Second World War. It wasn't a new type of bomb or a secret technology. It was a hamburger and a bottle of Coke. To understand how a simple meal could provoke such profound, life-altering emotional crisis, you have to understand the world these men were forged in. You have to understand what it meant to be a soldier of the Emperor. The world of Private Kenji Tanaka, a composite character representing the men in this photo, was one of absolute, unquestioning devotion. From the moment he was born, he was taught that his life had one supreme purpose: to serve the Emperor, who was not a mere political leader, but a living God on earth. This was the foundation of the entire Japanese society and the heart of its military code, Bushido. The code was simple and absolute. Duty was paramount. Death in service to the Emperor was the highest honor a man could achieve. A soldier's bayonet was not just a weapon. It was a conduit for his spirit. His rifle was not just a tool. It was a sacred trust. And his life was not his own. It was a single expendable grain of rice in the vast storehouse of the empire. In this rigid world of honor and duty, there was one concept that was utterly unthinkable, a stain so deep it could never be washed away: surrender. The Field Service Code, issued by General Tojo in 1941, explicitly stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die, and leave no stain on your name." Soldiers were taught that if they were captured, they would cease to be Japanese. Their families would be notified of their death, because in the eyes of their nation, they were dead. Their names would be struck from village records. They were ghosts, dishonored, and forgotten. This spiritual indoctrination was reinforced by a second, more visceral layer of propaganda. The Americans, they were told, were not human. They were Kichikabehe, demonic, brutal beasts. If captured, a Japanese soldier could expect nothing but the most horrific torture imaginable. Their propaganda films showed leering American soldiers bayoneting prisoners, experimenting on them, desecrating their bodies. To be captured by these white devils was to face a fate far worse than a quick, clean death on the battlefield. It was this dual fear, the spiritual fear of dishonor and the physical fear of torture, that fueled the fanatical resistance Japanese soldiers showed across the Pacific. It's why they fought to the last man on islands like Attu and Tarawa. It's why they would launch suicidal banzai charges, armed with nothing but bayonets and grenades, directly into machine gun fire. It's why they would hold a grenade to their own chest and pull the pin rather than raise their hands and surrender. This was the mind of Kenji Tanaka as he lay in a water-filled ditch on the island of Saipan. His platoon had been wiped out. He was wounded. His rifle was gone, and he was starving. For weeks, his diet had been a handful of rice, supplemented with roots, insects, and boiled tree bark. He was delirious with fever, his body racked with dysentery. He knew his duty. He had one grenade left. He was supposed to press it to his stomach and join his ancestors. But as he heard the crunch of American boots approaching, a primal animal instinct overrode years of conditioning: the will to live. When a towering American Marine pointed a rifle at him and shouted, Kenji Tanaka did the unthinkable. He raised his hands. In that moment, his world ended. He was no longer Kenji Tanaka, son of a fisherman from Hokkaido. He was a ghost, a coward. He fully expected the demon in front of him to pull the trigger to end his shame. He waited for the bullet, but the bullet never came. Instead, the Marine motioned for him to stand, gave him a sip of water from his canteen, and led him away. Kenji's journey into a new reality had begun. He didn't know it yet, but he was on a collision course with a hamburger and a bottle of Coke, and it would destroy him far more completely than any bullet ever could. The first shock was the lack of pain. After being taken prisoner, Kenji Tanaka was herded with other captured soldiers into a makeshift holding pen. He was searched, disarmed, and then, to his astonishment, left alone. There were no beatings, no interrogations under torture. Medics, American medics, moved through the crowd, treating the wounded. A corpsman approached Kenji, saw the festering shrapnel wound in his leg, and without a word, cleaned it and applied a fresh bandage. The hiss of the disinfectant and the clean, sterile smell of the gauze were utterly alien. It was an act of simple professional decency, and it was a first crack in the fortress of his indoctrination. He had been prepared for cruelty, for the savagery of beasts. He was not prepared for this quiet, efficient humanity. It was profoundly disorienting. The next shock was scale. Kenji and thousands of other prisoners were loaded onto a transport ship, not a small coastal vessel, but a colossal ocean liner, a floating city of steel. The sheer size of it was incomprehensible. He had been taught that America was a decadent, weakening power, its industry crippled by the war. Yet here was a single ship, larger and more complex than anything he had ever seen, being used simply to ferry prisoners. As the ship pulled away from the island, he saw the rest of the American fleet stretching to the horizon. Dozens of warships, carriers, destroyers, all moving with a purpose and power that was terrifying in its scope. The propaganda he had been fed his entire life, the stories of glorious Japanese naval victories, began to feel like children's fables in the face of this overwhelming reality. The journey across the Pacific was a period of dread-filled limbo. Kenji and his fellow prisoners were kept below deck. They were fed twice a day. The food was bland and strange. Tins of salty meat, hard biscuits, and a bitter, dark liquid the Americans call coffee. But it was food. It was plentiful. For men who had been starving for months, this simple, regular sustenance was another psychological blow. Their own army had left them to rot and starve on a godforsaken island. The enemy, the demons, were feeding them. Every meal was an act of treason against a hunger he had been conditioned to accept as a patriotic duty. They landed in San Francisco and were put on a train. This was perhaps the greatest shock of all. The windows were not blacked out. The Americans let them look. As the train rolled east for days, Kenji witnessed a country that was not supposed to exist. He saw endless fields of corn and wheat, stretching the horizon, cultivated by giant, roaring machines. He saw cities with towering buildings and streets choked with automobiles. He saw women in colorful dresses, laughing and shopping. He saw children playing in parks. He saw a nation not scarred by war, but thriving in it. There were no bomb craters, no rationing lines, no pervasive fear. Where was the decadent, crumbling society he had been told about? This America was a titan, a giant of industry and agriculture, so powerful that it could fight a two-front war across the globe, and its homeland would remain completely untouched, a vibrant, bustling paradise of plenty. His destination was a camp in the middle of Texas, Camp Hearn. When he arrived, he was processed, given a new uniform, the one in the photograph, with POW stenciled on it, and assigned to a barracks. The camp was clean. There was running water. There were showers. There were beds with mattresses. After years of sleeping on the ground in jungles and ditches, a simple mattress felt like an impossible luxury. The guards were not the snarling demons of his nightmares. They were mostly young, lanky Texans who seemed more bored than anything else. They chewed gum, read comic books, and treated the prisoners with a sort of detached, professional indifference. Some even tried to be friendly, using broken bits of Japanese or hand signals to communicate. This casual lack of hatred was the most confusing thing of all. Kenji had been trained to hate these men with every fiber of his being. He was prepared to die killing them, yet they seemed to bear him no personal malice. They were just doing a job. This environment began to work on the prisoners in profound ways. The American strategy, guided by military intelligence, was not to break them physically, but to deconstruct their reality psychologically. They were given jobs in the camp, working on farms, or in laundries. They were paid for their work in canteen coupons. They could buy small luxuries, soap, cigarettes, candy. The very act of engaging in a simple economic transaction was a powerful dose of a different ideology. It replaced the feudal loyalty of Bushido with the individualistic logic of capitalism. They were being treated not as captured gods or dishonored ghosts, but as men. A new identity was being subtly, carefully constructed for them. It was in the state of profound psychological flux, a state of confusion, shame, and dawning awareness of a world far different from the one they knew, that the camp administration decided to hold a special event. It was the 4th of July, America's Independence Day. To celebrate, the camp commandants decided to give the Japanese prisoners a taste of a truly American experience. A special meal was prepared. The prisoners were lined up and led into the mess hall. They sat down at long wooden tables, and in front of each man, the camp cooks placed a plate. On it was a hamburger, a pile of boiled potatoes, and a sweating, dark bottle of Coca-Cola. For Kenji Tanaka, this was not a meal. It was a verdict. It was a final, undeniable proof that everything he had ever been taught was a lie. The scene in the mess hall was quiet at first. The prisoners stared at the plates in front of them with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. A hamburger. What was this? A piece of cooked ground meat, a thing of almost unimaginable richness, nestled between two halves of a soft, white bread bun. Bread itself was a luxury, but this was something else entirely. It was a symbol. It was a food from American movies they had seen glimpses of, the food of a prosperous, carefree world. It was not the food of warriors. It was the food of civilians, of families at picnic. The potatoes were simple, boiled, but there were so many of them, a heaping pile. In the Japanese army, food was fuel, strictly rationed, doled out in meager portions of rice and pickled vegetables. The idea of a pile of food, an amount based on satisfaction, rather than mere subsistence, was a foreign concept. And then there was the Coca-Cola, a dark, bubbling, mysterious liquid in a distinctive, curved glass bottle, a logo written in a flowing, alien script. It was a commercial product, a brand, a tiny piece of American capitalism sitting on their table. The aroma in the mess hall was overwhelming. The smell of grilled meat, of baked bread. It was a smell that didn't belong in their world of mud, steel, and death. It was a smell of home, but a home they had never known. Kenji Tanaka, like the man on the right in the photograph, picked up the hamburger. He felt its weight, its warmth. He took a tentative bite. The experience was a sensory explosion. The soft bun, the savory, juicy beef, the tang of the pickles and onions the cooks had added. It was a combination of flavors and textures he had no frame of reference for. His diet for years had been one of simple, monotonous necessity. This was complex. This was indulgent. This was delicious. And that simple fact, the fact that it tasted so good, was a source of profound shame. He was a prisoner. His comrades were dying on distant islands, starving in jungles, fighting for the emperor. And he was here, in the heart of enemy territory, savoring a meal more luxurious than anything the emperor himself was likely eating. Every delicious bite was an act of betrayal. He felt a deep, wrenching guilt. He was enjoying the hospitality of the demons. He was enjoying the fruits of the society he had been sworn to destroy. This guilt is visible on the face of the man in the middle of the photograph. He holds a napkin to his face, not to wipe away a spill, but to hide his tears. He is crying from the overwhelming clash of emotions. He is crying from relief because for the first time in years, he is not hungry. He is crying from shame because he is enjoying this relief. He is crying from confusion because the beasts who were supposed to torture him are instead feeding him a feast. He is crying because the very foundation of his identity, his honor, his duty, his Japanese spirit, is crumbling to dust in the face of a piece of grilled meat. Then Kenji took a sip of the Coca-Cola. The fizz, the intense sweetness, the unique, it was like nothing he had ever tasted. It was not water, not tea. It was pure, unadulterated pleasure in a bottle. It was frivolous. It was decadent. It was wonderful. And in that moment, something inside him broke. The years of indoctrination, the rigid code of Bushido, the fear of the demonic enemy. It all collapsed under the weight of this undeniable sensory evidence. The Americans were not beasts. They were people. People who made delicious food. People who invented delightful, sugary drinks for no other reason than enjoyment. And if that was true, if the propaganda about American culture was a lie, then what about the rest of it? Was the emperor truly a god? Was death in battle truly the only honorable path? Was Japan's cause truly righteous? The questions, once unthinkable, now flooded his mind, a torrent that swept away all his certainties. He looked around at his fellow prisoners. He saw their reactions. He saw the solemn intensity, the quiet shame, the hidden tears. And then he saw the man on the left of the photograph. And this man was laughing. His laughter was not the laughter of joy alone. It was the laughter of insanity. It was the laughter of a man whose entire reality has been so completely and utterly shattered that the only possible response is a kind of mad, hysterical release. He is laughing at the absurdity of it all. The absurdity of fighting and starving and nearly dying for a cause that was a lie. The absurdity of having been terrified of an enemy that gives him hamburgers. He is laughing at his former self, the fanatical, dutiful soldier who would have gladly died for an emperor, only to discover that life as a prisoner in America was, in this one surreal moment, infinitely better than life as a hero in the Japanese army. His is the laughter of a man who has been brutally, irrevocably set free. This was the true power of the hamburger and the Coca-Cola. It was a cultural atom bomb. It didn't just feed their bodies. It attacked their souls. It demonstrated, in a way no lecture or pamphlet ever could, the sheer, overwhelming abundance of American society. It showed that America could produce so much food, so much luxury, that it could afford to waste it on its enemies. It was a demonstration of power so profound, so casual, that it made Japan's desperate, scraping war effort seem pathetic by comparison. The meal became a turning point for many prisoners. It was the moment they stopped being soldiers of the emperor and started becoming individuals. It was the moment the war ended for them, not with a bang, but with a bite and a sip. They had been prepared to die for a cause. They had never been prepared to discover that the enemy's way of life was, by every tangible measure, better. The photograph of the three prisoners and their meal is not an isolated incident. It is a snapshot of a widespread, deliberate strategy employed by the U.S. military across its POW camps. The Americans had quickly realized that Japanese prisoners were a unique challenge. Their fanatical devotion and the disgrace associated with surrender meant that traditional interrogation methods were often ineffective. Physical coercion only reinforced their belief that Americans were brutal demons. A new approach was needed, one rooted in psychology and cultural warfare. This strategy was known as re-education. The goal was not simply to extract military intelligence, but to dismantle the ideology of Japanese militarism from the inside out. The camps became laboratories for this psychological experiment. The process began with kindness and abundance. Plentiful food, clean living conditions, and proper medical care were the first salvos in this war of ideas. They directly contradicted the propaganda the prisoners had been fed and created a powerful cognitive dissonance. Next came education. The prisoners were offered classes in English, American history, and democracy. They were shown American newsreels and films. This wasn't crude propaganda, showing American military might. It was far more subtle and effective. They were shown films about American family life, about farming in the Midwest, about the democratic process of elections. They were shown a society where the individual had value, where life was not solely dedicated to the state. For men raised in a totalitarian, militaristic society, these concepts were revolutionary. The camps also encouraged recreation. The prisoners were allowed to form baseball teams, put on plays, and practice traditional Japanese arts, like sumo wrestling and calligraphy. This was a crucial part of the strategy. By allowing them to engage in these activities, the Americans were helping them rediscover their identity as individuals, separate from their role as soldiers. They were not just cogs in the emperor's war machine. They were men with hobbies, talents, and passions. Baseball was a particularly powerful tool. It was a game they shared with their captors. Japanese prisoners playing baseball against the American guards became a common sight. In the simple, rule-based conflict game, the roles of prisoner and guard, enemy and captor, would temporarily dissolve. They were just two teams, playing a game. These small moments of shared humanity did more to break down the walls of hatred than any battle could. The hamburger meal was the apex of this strategy. It combined all the elements, the shock of abundance, the introduction to American culture, and the demonstration of a different way of life. It was a perfectly engineered psychological event, and it worked. Many of the Japanese prisoners who went through this re-education process were profoundly changed. When the war ended, thousands of them refused to be repatriated to Japan. They were terrified. They believed that their families and society would reject them as dishonored cowards. Some had become so attached to their new lives that they even petitioned to stay in the United States. For those who did return to Japan, the process of reintegration was often difficult. They came back to a country that was physically and spiritually shattered. They were often met with suspicion and shame, just as they had feared. But they also brought something back with them, a new perspective. They had seen the world outside the bubble of Japanese militarism, and they could not unsee it. These returning POWs, though small in number, played a role in the post-war reconstruction of Japan. They were among the first to embrace the democratic reforms introduced by the American occupation. They understood, on a deeply personal level, that the old way had been a lie. They had tasted the alternative. The story of Kenji Tanaka and his comrades is a powerful reminder that wars are not just fought with bullets and bombs. They are fought with ideas, with culture, and with psychology. The image of these three men is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective weapon is not one that takes a life, but one that changes a mind. It shows that indoctrination, however powerful, can be shattered by a single, undeniable truth. In this case, the truth was delivered on a plate. The hamburger and Coca-Cola did not represent a superior morality or perfect society. America had its own deep-seated problems and prejudices, but what they did represent was a world of overwhelming material abundance, individual freedom, and a casual confidence that was the polar opposite of Japan's desperate, sacrificial fanaticism. The man laughing, the man crying, the man eating in solemn silence. There are three different reactions to the same earth-shattering revelation. They are the faces of men whose souls have been put through a spiritual wringer. They sat down to that meal as soldiers of the emperor, as men who had lost their honor and were prepared to die. They stood up from it as something else entirely. Individuals confused and broken, but on the first step toward a new and unimaginable future. They never forgot that meal, because it was so much more than just food. It was the end of their world and the beginning of a new one.